Hello, Year 11, and welcome to the first of our online history lessons for our group. So, what we're going to do every week is either be recorded or live lessons, so we'll kind of mix it up and we'll try and hopefully keep as much continuity as possible, so things as the same as possible. Hopefully, through the explanations in the video, you can pause and you can go back, you can relook at things. And what you'll need to do is you need to follow through this video and complete the Google form as we go along, but I would strongly suggest having obviously paper and pen ready to help you out with that process. So as ever, we'll start with our do now, and we're going to keep revising and keep retrieving Germany and crime and punishment. So we'll do those on alternate weeks. So we'll start with Germany today. So make sure you have your paper and pen at the ready and the Google form ready to access. So what you might want to do is might want to trial them on paper first, so the answers on paper first, and then go through the answers and then upload to the Google form, or you might just want to have a go at the Google form. So it's up to you. So I'll give you that freedom. So we'll start by retrieving our Germany topic. So question 1, which building burnt down in February 1933? Which act implemented in March 1933 gave Hitler the powers to make laws without the consent of the Reichstag, which is effectively the end of democracy? When was the Night of Long Knives? Who was the president of the Weimar until his death in August 1934? What did Hitler declare himself in August 1934? Who were the Gestapo? What was the SD? When did the Nazis establish the first concentration camps? Which groups of people were placed in concentration camps when they were initially used, so not during the war when they first started? Who did Hitler sign a Concordat with in 1933? What was the Reich Church? What is censorship? Why did Goebbels order mass production of radios in the 1930s? What is the meaning of the term Aryan? Who were the Hitler Youth? Who were the Edelweiss Pirates? Who were the Swing Youth? And who established the Confessional Church? And lastly, when were the Berlin Olympics? So what we'll do here is, ideally, if you pause the video for 5 minutes and either write them down on a piece of paper, complete the Google form, have a go at them first, trial them. Okay, it's up to you how you do it, but you need to obviously complete that Google form eventually. Now let's quickly go through the answers. So the building that was burnt down was the Reichstag. Remember that Hitler blamed the communists for doing it. Van der Lubbe was arrested, so he claimed that they were terrorists attacking Germany and that he needed to put things in place. So the act that he implements is the Enabling Act. Remember, this gives him, he can now, doesn't need to use the Reichstag, he can just pass any law that he likes. So that's effectively the end of democracy. The Night of Long Knives was in 1934. Remember, he's getting rid of the SA, so Ernst Röhm, because he saw Röhm as a threat. The president until his death was Hindenburg, and obviously the death of Hindenburg is quite significant because Hitler can then join the role of Chancellor and President, and he declares himself Führer. The Gestapo were the secret police, so Hitler wanted to keep control in Germany, and the way that they did that is through this secret police. The SD were the intelligence agency of the SS, so they would spy on people, they would listen in on telephone conversations, and the SS would then go and track them down. The Nazis established the first concentration camps as soon as Hitler becomes Chancellor, effectively, in 1933, because he wants to put political opponents in there. So Jewish people don't get moved to the concentration camps really until the war starts. So at this time, it's really communists or anyone that disagrees with the Nazis. Hitler signs it with the Pope or the Catholic Church. What was the Reich Church? It was the Nazi Church, so they set up their own church. Censorship is controlling people's views. So Hitler doesn't want anything that comes away from the Nazi views. So he wants to control all aspects of life. So they censor anything that disagrees with the Nazis. He mass produces radios because he wants to indoctrinate people. He wants to get the Nazi message out there. So they had control of all radio, so they controlled all the stations. There's not like multiple different stations, it's the one state station. The meaning of Aryan, remember, this is what Hitler claimed, that the Germans were this Aryan race or this pure race. The Hitler Youth were the Nazi Party youth organisation because he wants to indoctrinate people, control their minds as soon as possible. The Edelweiss Pirates were a group another youth group who went against the Hitler Youth, and so were the Swing Youth, who established the Confessional Church. This was a religious group against the Nazis, and it was a guy called Martin Niemöller, and he very much disagreed with the views, and he's the one who writes the very famous kind of poem about first they came for the communists, then they came for etc, etc. And then lastly, the Berlin Olympics were in 1936, so Hitler used that as an opportunity to show off kind of the might of the Nazis. So next up, what we're going to do is look at a how useful question, like we have been doing. Remember, we've been building our skills about this how useful question. And we're going to look at this cartoon. This is a cartoon entitled Clemenceau the Vampire that appeared in a right-wing German newspaper in 1919. And what you can see here is you can see this vampire shape who was supposed to be Clemenceau sucking the life out of Germany, who was supposed to be this kind of innocent woman here. And this is quite a famous cartoon because it shows how the Germans felt about the Treaty of Versailles and how they felt that France really were the country who were sucking the life out of them. Remember, most of the fighting had happened in France, and therefore France were very keen to try and get lots of reparations, to punish Germany very severely. So we know that we've also been using our lovely phrases. So I'm going to put this page up because you might want to use this in a minute. Just you could pause it and come back to it. So these are the phrases we've been used to try and upskill our written work, and we know that they can only use in history certain types of sources, so therefore we can kind of prepare ourselves for the type of thing we would say about those sources. So what I'd like you to do now, and you probably need to do this on a piece of paper, is we've got this question: how useful are sources A and B for the inquiry into the German reaction to the Treaty of Versailles? Now we're just going to look at that source A, which is that Clemenceau the Vampire source that we've just looked at. So I've just put the written bit in the middle because there wasn't enough space for the picture as well. So what I want you to do is, on your piece of paper, just write out how you would, or what you would say in each of these different sections. So I'm going to go through it in a minute, what I would say, but I want you to have a go first. Remember, use our sentence stems to try and help you. So again, I'll give you 5 minutes just to really try and plan that how useful question. How would you write that paragraph on that source? And you guys are all getting really good at writing these paragraphs on these sources. So now what I'll do is I'll quickly go through the answers and how I would approach this type of question. Remember, they're not going to give you sources that aren't useful, so they're always going to be useful, but we've got to work out what they're useful for. So the sources are extremely useful into an inquiry about the reaction to the Treaty of Versailles. So we always start by relating back to the question. Always do that in any subject. The source is an insight into the public opinion at the time, produced in 1919. So the newspapers, because this came from a newspaper, often give us an insight into what the public are thinking at the time. So it's useful because it's a newspaper from the time. So we need to just say what the nature of that source is, which we've just done. It's a newspaper. However, and then we're going to look at, remember, limitations. The source has limitations because it could be exaggerating the truth. Papers often prone to hyperbole, they often exaggerate the truth, they often try and sell papers, don't they, to make things look worse. And we know that this is a cartoon, so it's very easy for a cartoon to be manipulated, and cartoons often exaggerate the truth. In the source, we can see Clemenceau as a vampire sucking the life out of Germany. So remember, state the content of it. This is useful because it shows how the Germans felt Clemenceau was the worst in punishing Germany at Versailles. Then I'm going to support that with my own knowledge. So I know that Clemenceau did indeed want to punish Germany severely at Versailles. If I wanted to, I could extend that by saying because France were the most affected by the First World War. Then I need to state another reason why the content is useful. So this is useful because it shows Germany clearly saw themselves as the innocent woman in the situation. They see themselves as the innocent party. And if I support that with my knowledge, I know that many in Germany didn't believe they should have lost the war, called it the stab in the back. So they felt they didn't understand why they surrendered. Now, the truth is actually they had lost the war. We'd put ships up to stop food coming in from Germany. They had lost it, but people didn't believe they had. And remember, Hitler later on says it's kind of this stab in the back is linked to Jews. They are the ones who are responsible for Germany losing the First World War. Okay, so what you need to do now is you need to go back to the Google form, and I've given space to write this paragraph out. So use the information I've just shared with you, use your planning as well to write out this. So I'll mark these and give you feedback on these paragraphs. So use everything we've got. Now I'm going to give you 5 minutes. If it takes you slightly longer, obviously that's the advantage of doing it this way, that you can just pause this and take as much time as you need. So now we're going to move to the origins of the Cold War and what we've been studying in the last half term. So we want to just retrieve that just to make sure that we are really getting good at knowing the origins of the Cold War. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple of videos, and then there are questions to answer.
Origins of the Cold War. The wartime alliance of Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin first met at the Tehran Conference, where they successfully planned the D-Day landings to begin clearing the Nazis out of Europe. They met again at Yalta in February of 1945, and it was here that they made several key agreements. Firstly, Germany would be divided into 4 zones of occupation: British, French, Soviet and American. Berlin, the capital, which was inside the Soviet zone, would also be divided into 4 zones of occupation. Stalin would be given a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe, but at the same time, an agreement was made that all countries freed from the Nazis would be allowed to choose their own governments, it'd be allowed free elections. And these two things, the sphere of influence and the free elections, is going to cause some tension later on. The final thing that was decided at the Yalta Conference was the setting up of the United Nations as a peacekeeping organisation. The big three met for the third time at Potsdam in July of 1945. Now, with the Potsdam Conference, some things had changed. The aim of the Potsdam Conference is to ratify, to confirm the agreements made at Yalta. But the changes are quite important. Firstly, some key individuals had changed. Hitler had died. Now, this removes the glue from the alliance. It removes the common enemy. Secondly, Roosevelt had died and been replaced by Harry Truman. Now, Harry Truman was an avowed anti-communist. He didn't have a lot of time for Stalin. He had a great hatred of communism. The Americans had also successfully tested the first atomic bomb. Stalin doesn't have an atomic bomb, so now you've got the beginnings of a nuclear arms race. Despite the promise of free elections, the Soviet Union had begun to establish communist governments in Eastern Europe. For example, a communist government had been set up in Poland. Now, the American reaction to this is twofold. Firstly, you've got the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is an American statement that they will give help to any country resisting communism. It will go on to be known as the policy of containment, containing the spread of communism. Going hand in hand with the Truman Doctrine is the Marshall Plan. Now, on the surface, this was American money being used to rebuild Europe after World War II. In reality, it was America using its economic power to create allies, to create countries that are in its debt and will therefore be its allies against the Soviet Union. Now, the first place this money is really used to any great effect is in rebuilding West Germany. Stalin gets very upset with this. Stalin wants West Germany and all of Germany to remain crippled. The Americans are using Marshall Aid to pour money into West Germany. They are reviving the West German economy. Stalin can't really do anything about this. So what he decides to do is try and force the Western allies out of the city of Berlin, which, remember, is deep inside Soviet territory. He does this by cutting all land access to the city. He cuts rail, road and canal links, hoping that the Americans, the British, the French will just leave and he'll have the whole city to himself. Instead, the Allies decide that they will supply Berlin from the air. Thus begins the Berlin airlift and the airlifting of food and supplies into West Berlin for 11 months until Stalin finally backs down and reopens the borders.
We've got here is, when was the Tehran Conference? List one consequence of the Tehran Conference. Who attended the Yalta Conference? What date was the Potsdam Conference? When was the Truman Doctrine? What was Marshall Aid? Who created Common Form? What was Comecon? What happened in June 1948? How did America respond to what happened in June 1948? What was the GDR? What is NATO? When was NATO formed? So those of you who do citizenship, remember you've got a good understanding of NATO. When was the Warsaw Pact created? When did Stalin die? Who took control of the USSR after Stalin's death? What was de-Stalinization? Who was Rákosi? When was the Hungarian uprising? And what happened to Nagy following the Hungarian uprising? Remember, it wasn't a good thing. Again, I'll give you 5 minutes just to go through those answers. You might want to practice them first on a piece of paper before doing the Google form, or you might want to just have a go at them on the Google form. So let's go through the answers. So we know that the Tehran Conference is the first of the conferences, the first meeting of the Grand Alliance, and it was in 1943. Consequence of the Tehran Conference is that obviously they planned the D-Day landing, something they called Operation Overlord. Who attended Yalta? So that was Stalin, Churchill and Roosevelt. Remember, it wasn't until the Potsdam Conference that we have a change of leadership. The Potsdam Conference is in July 1945, so Germany have surrendered. Japan haven't, so the war hasn't technically finished. That doesn't happen until obviously the Americans use the nuclear bombs in August against the Japanese, and then they surrender. Truman Doctrine came in 1947. Remember, that's Truman saying that he wanted to try and contain the spread of communism. Marshall Aid is money given to Western European countries to stop them becoming communist countries. So the USA, remember, were determined that Western Europe wouldn't become communist. Cominform is created by the USSR, so it's created with its satellite states, so all those Eastern European countries it took over. Comcon is the economic planning between the communist countries, so they wanted, it's basically the communist version of Marshall Aid. What happened in June 1948 was the Berlin blockade. America responded with the Berlin airlift. The GDR was the East German side, so the German Democratic Republic. NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so remember that's a collection of capitalist countries. So we had that on one side, and then the Warsaw Pact was the Russian version. NATO is formed in 1949, the Warsaw Pact a bit later, so 1955. Stalin dies in 1953. Who took charge after him is Khrushchev. Now, initially, Khrushchev is quite critical of Stalin, and they go through this policy of de-Stalinization, where they want to try and change what Stalin had done and be less controlling, although we know in reality that doesn't last very long, and Khrushchev becomes just as controlling. Rákosi was the leader of Hungary under Stalin. Hungarian uprising was in 1956, and Nagy sadly was killed after the Hungarian uprising. So we're now going to move to our next part of the Cold War. So the last thing we did in that last lesson we had, we looked at the construction of the Berlin Wall. We know that the sides are very much divided. We're now going to move across a bit to Cuba. So Cuba is a country just underneath America. And we're going to start by looking at the Bay of Pigs incident, which will lead us to looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we need a bit of background knowledge first on Cuba. So Cuba is this country here, you can see on this map, the capital is Havana. It is very, very close to the United States, and that's something that's going to be really significant, the distance it is to the United States. Because remember, America, through the Truman Doctrine in 1947, have said that they're going to go anywhere in the world and stop the spread of communism. They hate this idea of communism. They think it's threatening to their way of life. So here now we've got this big problem we're going to have this big problem with Cuba, which is very, very close to the United States. Now, up until 1959, Cuba was run by this guy called Batista. He's this first guy you can see in this picture. And he is an ally. You can see him with some Americans here. He is an ally of America. So he basically supports America, or they support each other in terms of it. So there are a lot of American companies in Cuba. They have lots of American people go on holiday to Cuba. Cuba is a country where there's lots of rich people, but also a lot of very poor Cuban people, and a lot of Cuban people are very unhappy with the situation. They don't like how their country is being run. And one of those significant figures who doesn't like how the country is run is this guy called Fidel Castro, who's this guy here on the right. And he has an uprising in 1959 and he takes over Cuba. So he is a communist, so they become a communist country. So remember, America is really worried about communism, and suddenly Cuba, which is on its doorstep, has become a communist country. So what he does is he kicks American companies out of Cuba, and this leads to an American ban on trade. So suddenly the relationship between these two sides becomes very fractious. They don't like each other now. Now the Americans don't like Castro, and they want to get rid of Castro. So in 1960, when Kennedy becomes president, he inherits a CIA invasion plan to overthrow Castro. And the plan was they were going to send Cuban exiles, so people who had been kicked out of Cuba for supporting America, back to Cuba, and they were going to arm them, they were going to train them to try and get rid of Cuba. So they weren't going to send American troops, they were going to send people who had been kicked out of Cuba. So the Cuban exiles are trained by the CIA in Florida and Guatemala. The whole operation had a budget of 45 million, which is quite a lot back then. The exiles called themselves La Brigada. And by the time they had completed their training, they numbered about 1,500. So 1,500 of them were going to go back, and they were going to try and overthrow Castro. Now, on the 15th of April, US planes bombed part of the Cuban Air Force. The next day, 16th of April, the planned second wave of bombings was called off. This allowed the remnants of the Cuban Air Force to regroup and fight back. So there's already going to be problems with this invasion. They should have probably bombed them a second time. On the 17th of April, La Brigada landed at the Bay of Pigs, and that's why it's called the Bay of Pigs incident. So the Bay of Pigs is this beach in Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. But they encountered forces of about 20,000 men from Castro's army. Remember, there's only 1,500 of them. The Cubans had been alerted by spies overhearing members of La Brigada discussing the invasion in Miami. So Castro knew that this was coming, and therefore he was able to send lots of men to stop this from happening. So when the fighting eventually ended on the 19th of April, about 100 of La Brigada were dead, and there was about 1,100 who were imprisoned. So it's a disaster. And remember, Kennedy is this new president, and it's very embarrassing for Kennedy. So the Cubans offered to sell captured Brigadista back to America in exchange for 50 million in medicine and baby food. Kennedy reluctantly agreed, so he buys back these imprisoned people, and it's not a good look for Kennedy. So Kennedy was left embarrassed by the invasion failure, as it had blown up in his face. This may have made him more likely to take a hardline stance in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and to sanction assassination attempts on Castro through the Operation Mongoose. So it's not a good look. It shows that he's failed in his first kind of operation against the Cubans. So this is going to have consequences. Remember, this whole topic is about consequences. Remember this domino effect. One thing happens and it leads to another. So in the next lesson, what we'll look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is when the world was closest it had ever come to nuclear war. What you need to do now is write a summary, in the space on the Google form for this, of the Bay of Pigs incident. So I want you to tell me what happened during this Bay of Pigs incident. So if you need to go back to some of the explanation I've just had and use the video, then please do that. So write a summary of what happens during the Bay of Pigs incident. Thank you, Year 11, for your commitment to this first lesson. Obviously, we'll have more lessons next Wednesday and Thursday. We've been, as a team, as an SLT team, we're extremely impressed with how engaged Year 11 have been with remote learning so far. So keep up that brilliant work.